So this lecture continues to look at the evolution of the Peloponnesian Wars. I've kind of divided up into three different phases just to kind of group some of these actions in a way that makes some sense. Obviously not discussing sort of every encounter between Sparta and Athens, or even every foray of Athens into Spartan territory, but just kind of giving you a sense of how things evolve and how the different sort of phases play out. So the first phase is often called the Archidamian War. So this picks up in 431. So they had that 30 years peace. It's not really sticking. In part, Athens continues to be involved in trying to sort of expand its control across the Aegean, but also is coming into direct sort of conflict with Sparta because part of Athens' expansion involves some Spartan allies, and so then Sparta is forced to respond. So the immediate catalyst of this particular war, it's not really one thing. It's more kind of this gradual buildup and just kind of culminates in just Spartan frustration with Athens continuing to kind of create problems for them. I think Thucydides obviously identifies Athenian expansion and the Spartan belief that they were somehow compelled to check that expansion as sort of central to this conflict. I also do think, and again, we're so reliant on Thucydides for so much of this, but I also do think at the heart of this conflict, there is this ideological difference between sort of Spartan belief that the ideal form of government is an oligarchy, that there are certain members of society that are sort of best suited to govern, and then what you have in Athens, which is this antithetical sort of democracy, right? So this idea of bringing as many people into the governing process as possible, which the pro-democratic forces in Athens believes is the way one should govern. But there are also these oligarchical forces there as well that think, Sparta's right, and that's what we should have too. So it's not this sort of divide between Athens, all democracy, Sparta, all oligarchy, but clearly Sparta does feel that the democracy is the cause of a lot of Athenian expansion and Athenian ambition. So in the 430s, you have this ongoing dispute between Corinth, which you can see here, which is on the Peloponnesus and is a member of the Peloponnesian League. Corinth as a colony, Corcyra, which is up sort of in that north, right? And this is an ongoing dispute. It's super messy. It gets really bloody. It's also between this battle between pro-democratic forces and pro-oligarchic forces. And in part because Corcyra is an island, it has the second largest fleet in the ancient world, second only to Athens. So Athens gets involved in this dispute and sides with Corcyra against Corinth. And so Sparta at one point says, Corinth appeals to Sparta, you need to do something, you need to check Athens. Sparta doesn't really want to get drawn into this conflict, but it is just another one of these moments where Sparta feels like Athens is kind of causing problems. The other issue is what's called the Megarian Decree. And again, a lot of this comes from Thucydides. So Athens issues this decree and puts sanctions against Megara. And Megara is a member of the Peloponnesian League as well. So Athens puts these economic sanctions on Megara that hurts Megara. So Megara appeals to Sparta and says, hey, they need to lift these sanctions because it's causing problems. Sparta feels obligated to ask Athens, look, this is our ally, stop messing with them. And Athens absolutely refuses to withdraw the decree. They see that as sort of a sign of weakness. And so they kind of continue to provoke Sparta. In part because of that, in 432, the Peloponnesian League votes for war. But there is still some sort of hope, at least in the side of Sparta, that they can find some sort of diplomatic solution and not actually have to engage in battle. So nothing really happens immediately. The other thing that's part of this is in 431, Thebes attacks Plataea. And in this particular instance, Plataea is the Athenian ally and Thebes is the ally of Sparta. So Athens then feels like they're kind of drawn into this conflict because they have to sort of stand up for the ally. That Thebes isn't successful and eventually they withdraw their troops, but it just sort of more evidence of this sort of gradual building up of conflict. So the reason why we call this the Archidamian War is because it's King Archidamus II of Sparta who really then takes to the field of battle. And so in part, this just sort of happens because he is trying to make a point about Athenian aggression and check Athenian ambition. And there is also this goal that they don't like what's happening with the Delian League. They feel like a lot of those allies of Athens are actually kind of enslaved. And the tribute that Athens is demanding is sort of a sign of that subjective sort of relationship. So what happens is Archidamus and the Spartan army invade Attica, this territory around Athens. The goal is to time it with the harvest and just to really inflict a lot of sort of economic and financial devastation on the people. They're trying to force Athens into open battle to take their army out and meet them in pitched battle because Sparta is pretty convinced they would win that battle. That does not happen, and I'll talk about why in a second. But so you have like 5 out of 7 years, this Spartan army shows up around harvest time. They sort of devastate the countryside. The people who are living there then retreat within the walls of Athens. So they're not physically harmed necessarily, but then they go back after this 2 or 3 week period when the army is sort of in Attica to find their homes destroyed, their farmland burned, and they have to start over. So more than anything, it's obviously a prolonged conflict, and it just has this sort of psychological impact on the people of Athens, and this fear that it's just going to kind of continue to happen again and again. One of the primary reasons why the Athenians continue to just sort of seek sanctuary within the walls of Attica and allow the devastation is that this is the strategy counseled by Pericles, who's sort of the leading statesman of Athens. He's one person that pretty much everybody agrees they will listen to. And he says, look, we know we cannot beat Sparta in pitched battle. That would be foolish. And that's what they want. So this is a war of attrition. They cannot keep doing this. Eventually they'll give up. The damage that they inflict, yeah, it's not great, but it's not that detrimental. We can rebound from it. And so in part because they have these long walls built, it connects the city to the port at the Piraeus, so they can continue to bring grain in through the Piraeus to feed the population. They can also then use their fleet to raid the Peloponnesus and cause problems for Sparta and Sparta's allies. And so as long as Pericles is sort of in command, even the voices who aren't super crazy about this strategy go along with it, and they sort of agree that they're going to sort of follow Pericles' lead. Unfortunately, during one of these raids, what happens is you have this huge population in Athens because these people are coming in from the countryside. And so about 100,000 extra people within the city walls, and that's not a lot of space. So many of them don't have homes or residences. They're kind of living in these makeshift camps on the street for weeks at a time. Obviously, there is no sanitation, and they've sort of overwhelmed the capacity of the community to deal with some of that, fresh water, disposal of refuse. And what we think happens, and this is still up for debate, we do know that there is a horrible plague. Plague is a Greek word. It means a blow from God. And it's just a word, a general word that they apply to any sort of really fast moving disease that kills a lot of people very quickly. So they don't identify it scientifically. What scholars have recently argued based on some investigation of graves that they actually found in this cemetery. So this is a cemetery, and on one end of it, they found this large pit that just had sort of these mass burials. They lose about a third of the population in a very short period of time. And so in part, they're just overwhelmed. And so they have to just sort of bury all these people in this mass grave. But scientists are able to do investigation on their DNA. They find like 150 bodies that clearly were killed by the same disease. And through investigating their teeth, they have concluded that it's probably typhus or some sort of typhoid fever that probably came in through the port from Africa. And so the devastation caused by the plague is obviously incredible. Almost everybody loses someone within their close family. Pericles himself eventually contracts the disease and dies. So there's going to be a huge political vacuum. And then on top of it, this plague never spreads outside of Athens. So for a lot of people, they see this as perhaps sent by the gods or sort of a particular punishment specifically for the Athenians. So after the death of Pericles, then you have this period when there's no clear leader in Athens. A few people try and kind of replace him, but you don't have that sort of balanced view, that sort of statesmanship. And in part, then we see a lot of sort of erratic policies. And this is sort of central in Thucydides, who kind of sees this period as one when Athens is trying to figure out, are they going to be more conservative, kind of toe the line of Pericles, avoid open conflict with Sparta, and try and use their other sort of tools to expand? Or are they going to just go out on the offensive and take Sparta on directly? And we'll see kind of the different views that people espouse on either side of that. One example of this sort of erratic policy is sort of a central debate in Thucydides' history with the revolt of Mytilene. So Mytilene, like many of these islands that were part of the Delian League, no longer want to be. And this is an inscription, I think is in the Met today in New York, but it's a list of tribute. So how much tribute, how much money? This is basically like a tax that Athens is extracting from all of these other city-states in the Delian League. And these city-states are frustrated. They see that they are completely subject to the will of Athens, and they're paying them a lot of money. So a city like Mytilene decides to revolt. So this is in 427. The assembly meets. As Thucydides tells us, there are several different sort of positions about how they should deal with the revolt of the Mytileneans. The one that the assembly initially votes on is extremely harsh punishment. So they vote to kill all the males and to enslave all the women and children, which again, this is sort of unprecedented treatment of other members of a Greek polis. They send the ship that's going to Mytilene as soon as the Mytileneans actually surrender. This is going to be their punishment. The next day, the assembly meets again and reconsiders their decision and realizes, that was probably overstepping. So they send a second ship that sort of reverses the course of the first and says, we changed our mind. So instead, they sort of gather up about 1,000 of the ringleaders of the revolt. They are executed. The walls of the city are razed, but the rest of the population remains intact. And so in part, Thucydides positions something like the Mytilenean debate as central to his narrative to really show how things in Athens are changing and how they're becoming so much more harsh in their treatment of these other Greek city-states as a result of their own ambition. So in 425, Demosthenes, who becomes one of the voices for this more sort of offensive strategy, gets permission from the assembly to invade Pylos. And you can see Pylos here. One of the reasons why this is strategic is because it's right off the Peloponnesus, and it gives him sort of access to some of the areas where the Spartan forces have gathered. The Spartans are still dealing with that fallout from the Third Messenian War. So in part, Demosthenes' plan is to construct sort of a fortress, a base of operations, and then draw some of those helots to support the Athenian cause. And then he just uses Pylos as a base of operations to sort of conduct this guerrilla warfare. So again, not meeting Sparta in open battle, but trying to inflict damage nonetheless. Sparta sends a relief force. So they have a small group of Spartans that are there. They send a relief force to just swell the numbers. We don't know exactly what happens, and this is really super unusual for Sparta, but there seems to be some miscommunication that relief force ends up being stranded at Sphacteria, the island here, and then Demosthenes and the Athenians are able to force them to surrender, which Spartans never surrender, so there must be more of the story than we know. But about 300 total hoplites are captured. 120 of those are Spartiates, are Spartan equals. And as we saw before, those numbers of Spartan equals are declining so significantly that that is a huge percentage of their army. And so this is a huge blow for Sparta. So Sparta then is going to eventually agree to enter into peace terms. In part, they do have some sort of leverage, even though they've lost those Spartan equals. They send their king Brasidas up to Amphipolis, and Amphipolis is up here very much sort of way in the north there, next to Macedonia. So this has been recently sort of conquered and resettled by Athens. It's strategic because of its location. It gives them control of the Aegean and particularly movement from the Hellespont. Thucydides was one of the generals that was dispatched by Athens to prevent the Spartans from forcing the surrender of Amphipolis. He gets there too late, and that's why eventually he's recalled to Athens and he's put on trial for his blunders and he's put into exile. In any case, Brasidas captures Amphipolis. He uses Amphipolis as sort of leverage to negotiate the Peace of Nicias. And so Nicias is the statesman in Athens who sort of represents this voice of caution, of a more reserved foreign policy. And so he says, okay, we will give you back these prisoners that we captured at Sphacteria. You give us back Amphipolis, and then we will acknowledge that you have control of Peloponnesian League, and then you acknowledge that we have control of the Aegean League. So almost going back to sort of pre-war status quo situations. However, we do know that there aren't a lot of people other than Nicias who are really committed to peace during this period. So for example, even after the peace is sort of negotiated and those prisoners are returned to Sparta, Sparta doesn't return Amphipolis to Athens. And then there are other sort of smaller encounters that happen during this peace that clearly are violating the terms, but Sparta and Athens both sort of just agree to turn a blind eye. So the next major sort of event that really does have significant consequences is the Athenian decision to invade Sicily. This is, again, something that we know about mostly through Thucydides. We know that he represents two different sort of views about this campaign as embodied in Alcibiades and Nicias. So again, Nicias is sort of more cautionary. He does not like this idea. He thinks it's a horrible mistake. Alcibiades is younger. He's very prominent in a lot of works during this period. So he's a central figure in some of Socrates' works. Alcibiades was a ward of Pericles. His father died in the earlier Peloponnesian Wars, so he was raised by Pericles. He's very wealthy. He comes from a very elite family. He's also described as extremely charming, very ambitious, but also very manipulative. He's going to be a major figure throughout the rest of these wars. So one example of where the Athenians are at in this particular moment is in 416. So remember the Mytilenean debate. What do we do to punish this colony or this city-state that's revolted? And they decide, we don't want to be super harsh. This time you have another sort of instance with the revolt of the city-state of Milos. And so this is the Melian dialogue, which is really prominent in Thucydides again. And so the city-state of Milos revolts. Athens launches a force to end the revolt. They starve them into submission, and eventually the city of Milos surrenders. And so this time they are going to go that far. So all the adult men of Milos are killed. The women and children are enslaved, so they remove the population and they replace it with Athenian settlers. And so Thucydides' sort of conclusion is the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And this is sort of, he puts this in the mouth of an Athenian orator to sort of say, this is the Athenian position at this point in time, that they're more powerful. because they're more powerful, they are not obligated to treat weaker city-states as equals, and there should not necessarily be this expectation of leniency. And this is the theater that's still in the island of Milos today. So what prompts the Sicilian invasion? Not totally clear. There was some discussion earlier on, like in the 440s, about an invasion of Sicily. As you can see, Sicily is off the coast of Italy. It is not close to Athens. It is not even close to mainland Greece. I think even today, a ferry from Italy to Greece, it's like 12, 15 hours. And that's today. So this is quite a distance. You do have some Athenian colonies on Italy proper, like Turai. Sicily, however, while it's kind of in this Aegean orbit, hasn't really been active in a lot of what's happened so far. But Sicily is very, very wealthy. It has really fertile farmland. Its cities are known for their architecture, their patronage, and their culture. So it's always been sort of attractive to Athens. The dominant city-state on Sicily is Syracuse. Athens does have an ally on Sicily in Segesta. And so there is some infighting in some of these city-states in Sicily. At some point, Segesta sends an embassy to Athens to request aid in this fighting. By the time Athens makes the decision to go to war, though, that fighting has ended. They've solved it with the truce. So it's not quite clear what the Athenian mindset was in invading Sicily at this moment. They definitely seem to be drawn by promises of wealth, particularly by promises of wealth from Segesta, who say, if you help us out, we'll reward you, very, very handsomely. They also are part of the argument that they make is about distinction, that this is a new generation of men. They deserve the opportunity to distinguish themselves in the field of battle. This is what their ancestors had during the Persian Wars. And so this is their sort of chance to do that. So there's extensive debate. Nicias represents the no vote. Alcibiades represents the yes vote. They go back and forth. When Nicias sees that the assembly is starting to move in the direction of Alcibiades, he tries to, his last ditch attempt to get them to not do this is to say, look, even if what you're planning is so not up to the task, you need even more men, you need even more money, you need even more ships. He's trying to dissuade them, but his strategy actually backfires. They still vote in favor of the war, but they increase the number of ships and hoplites that they think they need. So it ends up being this massive force of about 5,000 hoplites and archers. They build 100 triremes to sort of add to the fleet, and they're going to send this huge force the next summer to invade Sicily. In the meantime, a sort of odd event occurs that does have serious implications. And this is called the mutilation of the Herms. And again, Thucydides tells us about this. So the Herms are these statues, and this is one pictured here. They're sort of ubiquitous around Athens, and they mark particular places, like the agora or sacred boundaries of places. These statues are the head of the god Hermes. He doesn't really have a body, but he does have sort of an erect phallus. And so the erect phallus is about fertility. It's about asking for the god's protection, but it's kind of key here. So what we know happens is one night in Athens, there is a group of individuals, young men, who kind of move throughout the city and deliberately break off the phallus from a number of these Herms. Some people see this as just sort of a drunken act of a bunch of young men who've gotten a little rowdy. But as time passes, there's gossip and there's rumors, and it starts to become understood as much more than that. That actually this is not only blasphemy because these are religious statues, but an attempt to undermine the democracy of Athens. And how that evolves is really complicated. But we do know that 65 men are actually executed, or they flee Athens before they can be executed in punishment for this act. So that's how seriously Athens takes it. During the course of this investigation, Alcibiades himself is implicated. And so some people say he was actually sort of the ringleader with a bunch of his friends. He wants to stand trial immediately. He says, I did not do it. But for whatever reason, that doesn't happen. Instead, he's sent with the fleet with Nicias, who ends up being appointed general, even though he thinks this is like the worst idea ever. So Nicias and Alcibiades are appointed sort of co-generals of this Sicilian invasion. He gets to Sicily. At that moment, then the wheels of justice have turned, and so they recall him to come back to Athens to stand trial for his role in the mutilation of the Herms. He does not think that he will get a fair trial. He is convinced that he's being set up. So instead of going back to Athens, he actually deserts and he goes to Sparta. This leaves Nicias, the guy who never really wanted to be in charge of this invasion to begin with, in charge of this invasion. They also find that Segesta no longer needs their help. Segesta isn't as wealthy as they said they were, and a lot of these other ports on Sicily want nothing to do with Athens. So this is when then they kind of make the decision to focus their energies on conquering Syracuse. So this is a map of Syracuse. You can see it has the great harbor. This is a really developed city. It sort of rivals Athens in terms of architecture and wealth. Athens then engages in sort of this extensive, about a year period where there's no sort of major encounters with the Syracusans. They just build a bunch of walls. So Athens builds a wall to try and encircle Syracuse to sort of maximize their position. Syracuse then builds a counter wall to kind of intercept Athens' walls to prevent them from doing that. And this goes on for quite some time. Nicias doesn't want to really force the issue. He doesn't think they should be there to begin with. So at one point over the winter, he requests more funds. He does not see this as going well. Alcibiades, remember, went to Sparta. And so he becomes instrumental in advising the Spartans about what to do to stop Athens. And who knows better than Alcibiades? So he tells Sparta, you don't necessarily need to send a whole army because Syracuse has that, but just send an experienced commander. And that's exactly what Sparta does. And they dispatch Gylippus to kind of organize the Syracusan defenses. Nicias, when he hears about Gylippus and a small Spartan detachment arriving, thinks, okay, this is going from bad to worse. He actually sends a messenger to Athens, please let me resign. I don't want command of this fleet, and I think we should just go home. The assembly refuses to accept his resignation and instead begins to actually build another fleet that they're going to send for the spring. So in 413, the second army arrives. This is led by Demosthenes. He has about 73 additional ships. This is a replica of a trireme. And so you can see the two rows of oars as well as the bronze battering ram sort of in the front. Athens is pretty convinced that they have this sort of naval superiority. But Demosthenes engages in this night battle with the Syracusans led by Gylippus, and it's a total rout. Athens is just absolutely routed. They're kind of surprised by this loss. They lose a lot of ships and a lot of men. And so Demosthenes and Nicias kind of go back and forth, but Nicias eventually gets permission to withdraw from Syracuse, at least to sort of lift the siege. Not necessarily to go home, but to lift the siege. However, before he's able to do that, there's an eclipse, and he's convinced that it's a bad omen. So he delays his withdrawal for 27 days, and this proves to be a horrible decision. In the meantime, Syracuse sees the tides turning. They are able to get some of their allies come to provide reinforcements. And they force a battle in the great harbor. So the Athenian fleet is still in the harbor. The Syracusans managed to sort of create a chain of ships so that they can't get out. There's a huge naval battle. The center of the Athenian fleet completely collapses. Their commander is killed. The sailors then, so the battle ends. Then the next day, Demosthenes gives the order to sort of re-engage, and the sailors just refuse. So they leave the ships and they begin a march, about 40,000 hoplites over land, to just try and get away from Syracuse. Obviously, the Syracusan forces, they've under siege for years. Conditions have been horrible. They're not going to let the Athenians just leave like that. So they pursue them. So Demosthenes takes one contingent, Nicias takes another, about 6 days with no food, no water, hot sun. They're harassed by these Syracusan troops. Eventually, both contingents surrender. Demosthenes and Nicias are killed. They're executed. There are about 7,000 men who survived this march. So obviously that toll was pretty horrific. They're imprisoned in quarries. This is one of the quarries they're imprisoned in. You can see it pictured here. And they're kept for about 2.5 months. Some Athenians are wealthy enough, their families are able to ransom them. Those who aren't are sold into slavery. In the meantime, also on the advice of Alcibiades, the Spartans have fortified a place called Decelea, and you can see it here, right? So it's in Attica. They've built this into a base of operations so that instead of invading every summer, they can establish a permanent presence. And this is something that disrupts sort of trade routes and the grain supply, the overland grain supply. The other thing they do is they commission their own fleet. And so a lot of the allies, the Athenian allies, use the Sicilian defeat as an opportunity to revolt. They join the Spartans. The Spartans also create alliance with the Persians, and so there's a lot of Persian money that goes into building the Spartan fleet. And so this is sort of the final phase, the battle for the Aegean. There is a lot of unrest in Athens during this period, especially after the debacle that was the Sicilian campaign. At one point, an oligarchy comes in and replaces the democracy. Again, sort of pinpointing the democracy is the reason why these bad decisions were made. In 410, however, the tide has kind of turned. The Athenians are able to muster enough of a fleet that they engage the Spartans at the Battle of Cyzicus, which you can see here in the Hellespont. This allows them to reverse a lot of those losses that they've suffered in the last few years. And it is a decisive win. Alcibiades has returned to Athens. In part, things are so bad there that they're willing to take anyone they can get who provides some sort of leadership. So he's forgiven of all his crimes, and he's actually a huge reason why the fleet is successful at the Battle of Cyzicus. They're able to go back to Athens. The democracy is restored. The oligarchy that was there is kicked out. At this moment, the Spartans actually say, look, let's negotiate a peace. They're willing to give them very favorable terms, but Athens rejects those terms. And it's not super clear why. It seems to just be this idea that they need to be supreme no matter what. And they don't want to take another sort of peace that's just going to sort of leave things in the status quo. Which is a mistake, because in 405, the Spartan king Lysander, who's become a very capable naval commander, is able to completely defeat, just demolish an Athenian fleet at the Battle of Aegospotami. And it's not super clear exactly what happens. And you can see Aegospotami is up here at the very right of the map. So again, fighting for control of the Hellespont, fighting for control of the Aegean. It's not clear if there's a small contingent that engages in battle and is defeated and the rest of the fleet surrenders, or if there's miscommunication. But we know that 150 Athenian ships are lost. They're left with like 12 or 13 triremes. Building upon this success and this lack of defense that Attica has, Lysander then blockades the Piraeus. At the same time, the other Spartan king, Pausanias, invades Attica over land, and given this, Athens is forced to surrender. And so eventually then, that's exactly what happens, and they're in such a position of weakness that Sparta is able to dictate all of the terms of this new peace. So the outcome of the war, the Athenian fleet is capped at no more than 12 triremes. They forced Athens to dissolve the Delian League and to no longer collect tribute from all of those other city-states. The walls, especially the long walls of Athens, are raised. And Lysander, because he is a proponent of oligarchy and sees democracy as the cause of instability and Athenian ambition, gets rid of the democracy. He handpicks 30 Athenian aristocrats that he puts in place in governing. This is an extremely repressive sort of 8 months. Perhaps as many as 35,000 people are killed because of just they're confiscating land, they're killing people without any sort of cause, they're not following the laws. But it's a really sort of disruptive time for Athens, and just instability and fear, and just in part the complete sort of demolition of Athenian democracy and the Athenian fleet that leaves Athens in a real low point.